Welcome back to another episode of the Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Organic Olivia. Olivia is an herbalist, an entrepreneur, a blogger, and most notably an educator. You may recognize her as the founder and formulator behind Organic Olivia, the brand, or perhaps you've heard her voice as the host of the chart-topping podcast, What's the Juice? Organic Olivia started as a blog and quickly morphed into a fierce community of like minds on a divine path of learning, growing, and healing. Olivia is on a mission to understand the human condition while sharing both the present chapter of her life as well as the lessons she's learned getting here. Peeling back the layers isn't always pretty, but life is juicy and it's worth the squeeze. In today's episode, we take a deep dive into Olivia's story. We discuss how her parents getting sick and a spiritual experience transformed her relationship with herself, her fiancé, and her family. We also discuss how constructive criticism has been instrumental in her healing journey, why changing your identity is so powerful when it comes to change, why she turned her back on wellness trends, how she changed her relationship with dopamine, overcame multiple addictions, and so much more. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Organic Olivia to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Olivia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Doug.
I'm excited to chat with you. I'm super inspired by everything that you've overcome and what you've accomplished from a personal and professional level. And there's many layers to your journey. There's many layers of healing and things that you've overcome. I think a good place for us to start is I know in the more recent years, you had like a big spiritual awakening, I guess, if you will, over the last couple of years to where it transformed your relationship with yourself. It transformed your relationship with family, with your fiance, with work. Talk about like where you were like in 2020, like what was going on in your life? What was your mental health like? What was your relationship to yourself like? And then how did that lead to you like making a massive transformation at that time?
Well, are you kind of referring to what happened with COVID and my parents or a separate thing?
I'm referring to where you hit that moment where you took psilocybin.
Yeah. So, in really early 2020, before everything with the pandemic started, I've always had a history of difficult relationships with family growing up. I had, sort of a dysfunctional family model, tough mental health situations in terms of my parents' mental health, my mental health. So our relationships were always really strained. And my mom was actually in the early stages of Alzheimer's at that point. And so she's always been sort of a main driver as to why I've been so fascinated by not just health, but also psychology and the way that we can change our psychology and our mental health with our lifestyle habits, our nutrition, herbs, things of that nature. Sort of because I didn't want to go down the path that she did. And I wanted to be able to help myself in the way that I know she always wished she could help herself. So I was kind of struggling with a lot of things at that point. Again, our strained relationship, just my own journey with forgiveness, really, and kind of coming to terms with our relationship and the tumultuous nature of how I was raised. And my parents were the first people essentially in New York, or one of the first cases that came out of New York to have COVID. And it was really, really, really early. Nobody knew anything. And my parents were sick like late February. So I feel like everything blew up in March, but this was February. It was a crazy time. And both of my parents ended up being hospitalized at the same time in different hospitals because my dad kept getting discharged because they're like, there's nothing that we can do for you. So he was sent to my house and then had to go to a different local hospital. But essentially, they were both in hospitals in critical condition in the ICU at the same time. And I was kind of like, oh my goodness, I'm about to lose everything. I'm about to lose both of my parents at the same time. I didn't have a chance to fully forgive. I didn't have a chance to, come to terms with all the things that I need to come to terms with for my own spiritual, physical, and mental health. What am I going to do? So early 2020 was really all about fighting for them, fighting like hell for as many treatments as I could get for them and the proper care and learning how to advocate for them. And it was also about a deep, deep journey of forgiveness and self-awareness and just coming to a place of all there really is love, because you can lose people and lose anything at any moment. My mom ended up going on a ventilator for 3 weeks, and they essentially were like, we're going to lose her tomorrow, probably. And that night, I remember just crying hysterically. I had candles all around the room. I was praying, I was crying, and I forgave her for everything in the most deep and beautiful way that I could have ever imagined. And I just started kind of like screaming out, like, I want her to live. And it was the first time in my life where I was like, I really want my mom. I want this relationship with her, whatever I can get. Nothing from the past matters. Let's just move forward from today. And the very next day, she actually came off of the ventilator, which was like a miracle. And shortly thereafter, my dad also started getting better. And so both of my parents ended up surviving. And then it was a really long road of recovery. And I think for me, that was my year of responsibility, both in terms of my family, because I realized there's certain decisions that I was able to make that my parents actually couldn't. So I was almost turning into that parental role versus the child role. And then it was also this year of personal responsibility as well to myself, because I saw that both of my parents, were in very poor health and did not take care of themselves. And of course, that was always a driving factor for me. But I saw firsthand how a virus could come along or anything could come along. And if you're not caring for yourself like it's your job, you will absolutely have a poor outcome, and it can be really scary and dangerous. And so, almost saw like where my future could go if I didn't really take my health and especially my fitness seriously, because I think I always took my health seriously. That's why I'm in the wellness industry. That's why I'm an herbalist. But I didn't take my fitness seriously up until that point. And so as my parents recovered and as I started getting them to move and walk more, and as my mom was in rehab, I started walking more myself and joining a gym and just really getting to this next level of my health journey that also included being in my body and caring for my physical body. And then again, like that spiritual journey as well. That's the year I took mushrooms for the first time. I think I was ready to, because I had already gone through almost that psychedelic experience of massive forgiveness and love the night that my mom almost died. And I was kind of ready to just let the mushrooms take over without kind of having maybe a breakdown. Because I think that if I had taken them before I went through that process of forgiveness, it would have been too much for me. But yeah, that was a pivotal year for me. And I think that when anything like that happens in your life with your family and your personal relationships, it turns things upside down. And you can either totally break down from it, or you can choose to step up.
That's amazing, and it's really inspiring for you to share all this, and I think it's awesome that your parents are both, still alive after going through what they went through, and that how that negative circumstance in everyone's life for your family at that time, how that was able to be shaped into like something positive, right? And that like inspired you to take your healing journey, to take your health to the next level. And I definitely want to talk about like how your spiritual experience like unlocked a lot for you personally and professionally. But I want to go back for a second, because you mentioned like that you grew up and you had some trauma and there was a lot of mental health stuff going on when you were a kid. Were you aware of how this was all impacting you before your parents got COVID? I mean, you mentioned that like you had this moment where you're like, I got to let all this stuff go. I got to forgive my parents because, life's short. I might lose them. Before that, what was your relationship like with them? What was the trauma from your childhood? Like, were you aware of it, and was it impacting you as an adult?
Yeah, I think I was always very hyper aware of my home situation and the chaos. There was just a lot of conflict and fighting at home. And again, I just feel like my mom never got the proper mental health care and the proper tools that she needed to thrive, because she is such a genius and such a creative soul, but also a very like tortured soul as well, kind of like a tortured artist. And I just think that she never had anyone truly see her. And she also could never truly see herself and take care of herself in the way that she needed to. Part of that is her time and their generation. And part of that is maybe cultural. But we just had a really strained relationship growing up. And I remember being in high school, and I used to like Google psychology articles like Psychology Today or, different websites to kind of try to figure out why my mom was like behaving the way that she did, like why she was having certain outbursts at me, or, like what the dynamic in our family was called. I started to learn about attachment styles, and I was like, oh, okay, like she must have this anxious attachment style. And then I have that too. And like, here's why we butt heads and here's what's going on in our home. And so I ended up actually majoring in psychology in college. I started off pre-med because at the same time I had a lot of health issues, physical health and mental health issues. So I decided to go to college for and get on the pre-med track so that I could hopefully, solve those issues for myself, because I felt like no doctor could really ever pinpoint what was going on. And they kind of just prescribed me a bunch of meds that had side effects. And I didn't want that to be my future. So I started on the pre-med track, and then I actually got a lot sicker. I had a really bad freshman year of college. I had Epstein-Barr virus. My liver enzymes were through the roof. Doctors kept giving me antibiotics, which were making my liver enzymes worse. I developed like all of these swollen lymph nodes. And I was like, okay, Western medicine is not helping right now. I need to take myself to an acupuncturist or an herbalist and just try that route. And that's actually what got me into alternative health. But besides that, I switched off of the pre-med track once I realized that was not where my answers were going to lie. And I switched to majoring in psychology. And I think that actually studying psychology throughout my college experience helped me so much to understand in a way that the dynamic in my home growing up was not my fault and was also, in a sense, not my parents' fault either. Again, it was just not having the tools or the language or the information or the coping skills to understand how to communicate in a healthy way. And I realized that they were just in a lot of pain and feeling really lost as well, which just kind of contributed to things. So I guess it helped me to have compassion for them. But regardless, no matter how much compassion or information you have, and no matter how much you intellectualize a relationship that's really painful for you or the dynamic behind it, it still hurts. And especially when you're a child and you're the child in the dynamic that just wanted your mom to be your best friend and just wanted what all the other kids had, it's hard to like deeply, deeply forgive and let go of that anger. And I think 2020 and all of that happening was when I finally let go of that anger. And I can't explain how much that freed me as an individual and opened up a whole new world for me.
That's incredible that you like used again that time to dive deep and to seek out like education in the subject so that you could further understand, what was going on from a family dynamic point of view, and then also how that was all impacting you so that that way you could gain some self-awareness around, what was going on, even if like you weren't able to come to terms with it or completely move on and heal from that, you at least gain some understanding on why, you might behave certain ways, why you might have certain patterns. Cause I think a lot of times what happens is when people behave in a certain way and it's negative, it can be negative, whether it's, acting out of anger, creating drama all the time, fighting, and they just think they're a bad person. They're like, where does this come from? Like, why am I behaving this way? And I think once they can gain some level of understanding on like where it comes from, it starts to become normal in a way, right? Where they're like, all right, like this makes sense.
It takes the shame out of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've always said that information is essentially the most comforting thing to me. If I'm like having an emotional conflict, I need to learn more about the conflict, where it's coming from. And that again allows you to not feel guilty about it and to just kind of go at it with a plan of action and a place of understanding.
Right. And speaking of information, going back to your spiritual experience, it seems like that shaped you in many ways and that gave you a lot of data, a lot of information on some things that you needed to unlearn, some things that you needed to move forward from, some things that you need to like change in your own life. Walk the audience through like what was that like from like an understanding perspective? Like what did you discover about yourself as far as some patterns or as far as who you were and identity and how all that and like knowing all that helped you like become a better version of yourself throughout that process?
When I originally took the large dose of psilocybin that I spoke about on my show and just on Instagram in general, it was a major humbling experience and it allowed me a lot of self-awareness that I didn't have before. And I think the really beautiful thing about mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms or psilocybin, is that when you're ingesting this psychedelic and the way that your mind opens and changes, you're able to see yourself and essentially the quote bad parts of yourself or maladaptive parts of yourself from a place of just truth. It's not, oh, I did this and I suck because I did this, or, I'm a bad person. I need to go like cry about how guilty I am. It's just, oh, I did this and that's not nice and I'm not going to do it again, but it's just the truth. And I can't change that I did it or that I'm like this, but I can change it going forward. So I think it allows you to examine things from this higher perspective, and it allows you to see all parts of yourself in this really non-judgmental way, but in a way that it still hurts, but it's not that shame hurt. It's just that hurt of empathy, I guess. When I took mushrooms, I realized that I myself can be very selfish in many of the ways that I always accused my mom of being, or my dad, or whatever that is. Like it helps me more than anything to see that they're a huge mirror for me. And it's not just life is not just a blame game. And it helped me to see that actually having them in my life is probably the most protective thing that I have, the most protective gift, because I can continue to observe them and maybe some of the patterns that they're not ready to tackle and continue to say to myself, I'm like that too. And that's my new mantra that I've adopted that's really helped me. Even when I'm having road rage or someone makes me angry, I just say, I'm like that too. And I think of a time when I had behaved like that, and it really helps me to dissolve the anger, but also just have like a moment of a gift of self reflection. So, yeah, on the mushrooms, I realized my own selfish tendencies. I realized that a lot of the time, that selfishness or that not narcissistic lens, but maybe a self serving lens or behavior that I can engage in comes from a really deep place of insecurity and inadequacy. And it helped me to also realize that that does not exist, that we really are all the same. And it helps me to see the ways in which even things like my social anxiety, quote unquote, that I thought I really suffered, which I know is a real thing, but I thought I had this like thing that was wrong with me called social anxiety. But in reality, it was just kind of more of my selfishness of being in relationship with others and constantly wondering, am I interesting enough? Am I saying things that are funny? Are they liking me? Versus how can I just be more present with them in this moment? How can I just be curious about them? What kind of question can I ask to know more about them and make it about them instead of me sitting here constantly thinking about me? So it was just kind of a continuation of that year of responsibility where I learned that I needed to consider others a lot more. I needed to put others before myself at times. And I also needed to prioritize myself in a different way that was more disciplined versus fluffy and self-care style.
Right. And so how did you coming to terms with all these things that might have been hard to admit, maybe they still are kind of a little hard to admit because, nobody likes to admit that they're selfish, right? How did knowing all like once you knew all this information, like what were some of the things that you did like on a daily basis or on a weekly basis that helped you develop some new patterns and help like recreate yourself in a way that like things started to shift for you?
Well, interestingly enough, I guess it sounds contradictory or a bit paradoxical, but interestingly enough, part of that mushroom journey, it actually came as the conclusion to a month that I took off of work because I had started my business when I was in my sophomore year of college, right after I discovered herbs and alternative health. I started my blog that turned into a business, and I had never taken extended time off from the age of 19. So now I was 28 and I was like, you know what, I'm going to take a month off for the first time in my life. And during that month off, I had a lot of time alone. I had a lot of time to organize my home, which I had never really done before. And that helped me to realize that I was actually being really selfish to my partner by just focusing on work, work, work all the time and letting our home tasks go to the wayside or putting it all on him. And I also realized that I was a much happier and softer person when I had this time alone and this time off of like work and ambition and just focusing on goals and making a living and all of this. It was a really interesting month of just being a human, learning how to be a human again. And so I remember at the end of that month, right after, actually, right before I took the dose of mushrooms, I was laying with my partner and he said, "Do you really have to go back to work tomorrow?" And I was like, "I do, but why? I thought you were excited for me to work again. And, I'm so passionate about it." And he's like, "I am, but I love this part of you or like this version of you that I've seen this month. And I'm not ready for her to leave yet." And I think him saying that right before we went into the mushroom journey kind of cracked me open. And I was like, wait, what does he mean? So what came out of that was I realized that I'm a much nicer person to other people and I'm a lot less selfish when I take enough alone time. And that I think more intentional alone time helps me to actually be more present and intentional and giving when I am with people. And so ever since then, I've baked in a lot more alone time into my days in terms of exercise, just self reflection time, journaling. And I've also baked in a lot more solo travel and solo experiences into my life, which I think has also given me a greater sense of self worth, which has translated into healing a lot of that inadequacy and insecurity that was causing some of that selfish or chaotic behavior in my relationships.
Mm. So diving into that, this is something that I think a lot of people struggle with is that when they're at a point in their life where they're maybe feeling inadequate, their self-esteem is on the lower end, like hearing like a hard truth, like what your fiance told you is hard to hear. And sometimes, it seems to me like you have a growth mindset and you're very focused on like bettering yourself. So I can see how you were able to use that to a certain extent to be like, all right, I really need to do something about this. But maybe there's some people that have a hard time hearing that stuff because maybe they're just not as they haven't developed the self-awareness or whatever it is. Like what advice would you have for someone who's on the receiving end of like a hard truth from their partner or from a friend when it comes to something that they maybe need to do a better job of?
Maybe it goes back to that growth mindset that I naturally have, or perhaps the mindset that the mushrooms gave me. But it really just goes back to truth just is. You can't change the truth, and it's selfish to want to change the truth because it just is and it just exists. And if you try to deny that and try to deny reality, I don't think you'll be able to move forward in your own reality. So, although it might sting at first to hear, whether it's the truth coming from a partner or whether it's the truth of something that you're afraid of, right? Like, let's say, I don't know, let's say you have a business and you want to tell yourself that you're the best in the business and everything is always going to be fine and you have no competition and no one's better than you, right? Like this is like the lie that you're telling yourself. And then you see someone who's your competition who's actually working a lot harder than you, doing a lot better than you, excelling really in their purpose, really aligned. If you shut your eyes to that and just say, no, 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 I'm doing the best I can, you're not going to grow from it. You're denying a truth that's going to help you grow. But if you actually look at what they're doing and allow yourself to acknowledge them and be inspired by them and sit in the truth of, wait a second, there is competition out there. I do have to keep changing and learning and growing and working hard. You can use that truth to move you forward, even though at first you might feel that twinge of jealousy and envy and pain from seeing that person that you feel in competition with. Maybe that's a bad example, but I just think about the fact that, I don't know, even though the initial sting of truth is so painful, the way that it like sticks with you and replays in your mind and kind of drives you forward the next few days, next few weeks, it changes you as a person. And you're going to be really grateful at the end of it that that person was honest with you or that you allowed yourself to face that, because if you let it, it will change you. And it's kind of like a natural thing. Once you digest that truth, you have no choice but to act differently. And you don't really have to work too hard at it because it just becomes a part of you.
Right. I mean, it's like the old saying, you just got to rip the Band-Aid off, right? Because if you rip the Band-Aid off, like the initial pain with something is like a level 10. It freaking stings. It hurts. But eventually, like you understand like where the pain's coming from or why you're in so much pain. And you begin to do some things, hopefully, that allow that pain to subside a bit. And I think when you pull the Band-Aid off like halfway or a little bit, like you still can't really
It's
see like
worse.
where the wound is, right? It's just worse. It just ends up festering like long term.
Yeah, like that Band-Aid catches on everything and you're constantly in just a little bit of pain and you can never figure out where it's coming from.
Right. Or, it's like it becomes contagious and then the pain ends up like interfering with relationships, your work, and then like all this stuff starts to happen and you're like where is this all coming from? And it started with sometimes that low level pain that somebody like didn't really understand how to address. And diving back into your story, I want to talk about your relationship with dopamine because I know there's a lot of parts of your story where you've chased dopamine, whether it be with work, whether it be with different ways to escape, whether it was with food. You've done a lot of research on this subject. Like, what have you come to terms with as far as like what your relationship with dopamine was like a few years ago, and how has that changed in present day?
Well, it's interesting. I was just going to say that hiding from the truth, I think, causes you to go towards those substances that give you that artificial boost of happiness and dopamine because it allows you to escape, And I think that the more you go towards truth within yourself and within your relationships, the more you allow yourself to become more intimate in those relationships and more intimate with yourself to where you don't want to escape and hide. And I think that was probably a really big part of why this past year, specifically 2022, after having this awakening, after having this journey with my parents and stepping into this place of responsibility, I was ready to examine my own avoidant and escapist tendencies and how I used substances to further bring myself away from the hard truths that I now knew were good for me because I couldn't hide from that fact any longer. So I was kind of like, how can I fully face life And what is it that I turn towards when I do want to hide or when I am coping with something in a maladaptive way rather than facing it head on? So for me, with my history, again, growing up in my home, food addiction was very much present. That was my parents' coping mechanism. There was never any drugs around. There was never any alcohol. I never even saw my parents take a sip of alcohol. So I always thought that there were no issues. But what I did realize is that we all had a really major addiction to food. And I kind of like just not inherited that from my parents, but, modeled my behavior after them. From a really young age, I was always going on diets with my mom. We would say, okay, tomorrow we're going to we're going to like eat all of the junk in the house, and then diet will start Monday. So my mom and I would like binge eat together. We would go to the store, get M&Ms, Fritos, every junk food you could imagine, and just like eat on the couch for hours. And then our diet would start, and then we'd fail 2 days later. Or my mom would like teach me how to like chew things and spit them out to like avoid calories. Like it was very disordered. And I also, in my younger years, I went to Weight Watchers in the 6th grade. Like I had always struggled with my weight and being overweight in my relationship with food. So I knew that food was one of my major coping mechanisms, and that just like my parents, I would hide food and eat it in secret and like late at night go for the food instead of going for a drug, for example. And then as I got older, I also started using cannabis, which I think is a wonderful plant medicine. Similar to mushrooms, it does have psychotropic effects. It is a wonderful entheogen that helps you to have more empathy and think about your life from that higher perspective. But if you overuse it, whatever that looks like for you, if it becomes habitual and it becomes something that you rely on, biochemically, mentally, emotionally, then I think it becomes a maladaptive crutch or vice or addiction or coping mechanism, whatever you want to call it. And for me, it definitely became that. And I think in general, I realized that for me, whenever my brain likes something, it just becomes a problem. Like I just realized I'm like one of those people. I know that Dr. Anna Lemke, who you've had on your show, says that once you become addicted to one thing, it's just so simple for you to become addicted to something else and something else and something else because your brain is just wired for that. So I wanted to understand, like why is food such a high for me? Why is cannabis something that I simply can't stop, even though I say I can stop at any moment, but it's something that I'm hiding or sneaking, or I'm afraid to travel because I won't be able to smoke at night? Why is it that like when I drink coffee, I want another one and another one and another one, and I get on this high until I crash? Why is it like that with sugar? Like I just kind of started to take stock of my life, and at first I thought I was broken. I was like, maybe I'm just one of those people with a brain that's highly addictive, perhaps because of my childhood trauma. And I know that you've probably heard about the rat study where when you have a rat isolated in a cage away from social connection and its natural environment, it will take cocaine and become addicted to cocaine. But when a rat is in a rat park that's highly enriched with social connection, with colors and activities and all of its natural enjoyments, it does not even want to take the cocaine. It doesn't even want to try it. So I thought, okay, maybe that's what it is. I have this trauma and my environment just isn't good for me. And I just have to work extra hard at breaking these things. Then after listening to Anna Lemke, I realized that all of our brains are actually just kind of wired for addiction because we no longer have to survive. We have all of our basic needs met, food, shelter, and water. And every single day is no longer this kind of primal battle of friction that provides this excitement almost because we're in survival mode. And so then I realized, okay, I'm not broken. I'm just somebody who needs a lot more friction. And I also realized that after years and years of allowing myself to overindulge in hyperpalatable foods and caffeine and cannabis and whatever my drugs of choice were, I had brought my dopamine, or I had kept it with my actions artificially at a much higher level. And what happens is once you stop those substances or withdraw from those activities or consume them in even a more balanced way, your dopamine is going to naturally drop to a level that's much lower than your natural baseline, just your natural baseline of what would feel good in normal life. So without those substances, you are going to feel bad and you're going to feel depressed and anhedonic, and you're not going to be able to find or draw pleasure from normal life activities and even beautiful social connection and nature and all that good stuff. So I just realized that the longer I tried to kind of like have balance with these things, the more I was just going to prolong the up and down pain cycle. So I embarked on my 2022 journey of what is left when I take everything away? Like, who is left when there's no external substance kind of keeping me artificially high? And so I started with cannabis, which was January of 2022. I stopped it cold turkey. And it was really interesting because a lot of emotions came up, again, specifically surrounding my mom, because after COVID, after she got off the ventilator, again, she already had Alzheimer's, but due to the lack of oxygen in her brain and all of the damage from the vent, she came off of her sickness really, really just kind of like late stage. And she lost a lot of her cognition. So essentially, even though my mom survived COVID, she, like my true mother, didn't really survive it. She was more a shell of herself. And it's just kind of been like a slow burn from that point. So there was a lot of grief that I had to face because at first it was like, oh my goodness, she's here, she's alive, everything's fine. But the truth of it is that in many ways I had already lost her and that was the inevitable conclusion anyway. So once I stopped smoking cannabis, I had to face the pain and the reality of grieving someone who's still here and grieving a major relationship in my life. And I had avoided that for so long by just getting high and ignoring it and dissociating or laughing or like forcing myself to sleep, right? So I had about a month of crying in January, and it was so healing to finally face that grief, because I found that the more you allow yourself the capacity for grief, the more you also expand your capacity for pleasure, and the more you allow appreciation for the relationships that are healthy and present in your life. So that was really big for me. And I think that helped many relationships in my life. And then in April, I decided to quit caffeine because I had been, again, really working on nourishing my nervous system, moving my body more, taking my mental health more seriously. And I could feel that getting this rush of adrenaline and dopamine from caffeine in the morning was doing the exact opposite of my goal, which was nervous system regulation and just an even keeled kind of emotional life. So I was at the coffee shop one morning and my fiancé handed me an espresso shot, which was my usual morning selection. And I said, my body physically cannot take this. I'm ready to stop. And I just stopped that day. I actually held a funeral for caffeine with my craniosacral therapist, which was really fun. It was like a little spiritual moment. And I did the same thing for my body when I decided to lose weight and get serious about fitness. And I can talk about that technique because it really works. But I held a funeral for caffeine and I let my brain, like little cartoon character of my brain in my head, give this eulogy and get out all of its, fears and pain points. And my brain was really afraid that I wouldn't be smart without caffeine, that I wouldn't be able to perform, that I wouldn't be worthy, I wouldn't be recognized for my output and my productivity, and that everything I built in my life would just go away. And I let my brain grieve a little bit. And I had the rest of my organs and my heart and my adrenals tell my brain, it's okay. This is what the rest of us need. You're going to be just fine. And the first month of no caffeine, because I had used caffeine every single day for 10 years straight, was really difficult. The first 30 days was terrible. I was really, really fatigued, really tired. I had intense muscle aches and pain in my legs, which is a side effect that happens to certain people during withdrawal because of the adenosine receptors. It's like an interesting effect that can happen in the legs. And I was really depressed. So it was another, I guess, swing from the artificial high of dopamine to going below baseline. And in both situations, Dr. Anna Lemke's estimate of 3 weeks to a month for your dopamine to come back to baseline was really true for me. So it took about 3 weeks to 4 weeks for me to kind of feel emotionally happy again after quitting coffee. But what I did find is that there was a day where I kind of hit rock bottom and I knew this is as low as it's going to get and it's up from here. I just had this like sixth sense. And sure enough, the next day I woke up and I began to feel so much more pleasure from little things that weren't hyperstimulating. Because I think when I was overstimulating myself so much with, cannabis, which can make things feel extra special, or caffeine, which can make everything feel, very exciting or, very present, I had lost the ability to just feel happy with tiny things in my life, like a bird passing by or a walk around the neighborhood. So I realized that I started to derive pleasure from the little things more. And I realized that my body was now craving ways that I could make a little bit more dopamine naturally. So my body was like, let's go for a walk. Let's have more sex. Let's get out in the sun. I had all of these natural instincts come through versus I need another cup of coffee. My body just learned to be a human again. And then I ended this journey in September of 2022 by experimenting with quitting sugar, quote unquote, but I would more so call it quitting hyperpalatable foods. So I just stopped consuming anything that was like a mega combination of added sugar, fat, and salt that was kind of hyper pleasing to my brain. And of course, just didn't consume refined sugar in that time so that I could just experience food at its natural sweetness, at its natural taste, the same way I wanted to experience life's natural sweetness without coffee.
Wow, what a journey. And thanks for sharing all that. There's a couple things I want to dive into. The first thing is you talked about like regulating your nervous system. And I think there's a lot of people that when they're going through hard times in life, they're quitting a substance like you did, like during those times, it's hard for them to self-regulate and then they end up turning to other substances or other things in an unhealthy way to regulate that. Other than you talked about like that you cried for a month and you were feeling the feelings and you got back into doing certain things that could give you like a natural dopamine rush, if you will. What were some of the things that you did and you continue to do today to help regulate your nervous system when you're feeling like emotionally charged?
So, number one, again, this is probably specific to me, but I'm sure for a lot of other people, but it was spending more time alone. That was really key because I realized that there were certain people that I wanted to use substances around, not because they wanted to use them, but because they were stressful to my nervous system. So, I guess spending more time alone, and B, sort of taking stock of my relationships and friendships and which relationships were really draining and taxing to my nervous system and caused me to want to self soothe with substance. And so I started to actually slowly distance myself from certain relationships last year and actually just like ended a few friendships sort of out of nowhere because something in me just said, I can't reach these goals if I allow this relationship in my life, because not because they're a bad person, but because we're playing out unhealthy cycles together. And for whatever reason, we're just kind of triggering something in each other that's not good. And then again, with the alone time, I just noticed that when I overtax myself and try to be too social or stretch myself too thin or work too much or whatever it is, I kind of put on that mask to be like social and happy and whatnot. It taxes me in a way that also makes me want to use substances or eat sugar. Specifically, I would get home from socializing, even though I know I should have left that function hours ago, but I stayed because of whatever, societal expectation. I would get home and want to just like binge eat cookies. And that's when I knew my nervous system was taxed. Another thing I did was I did allow myself to feel all of those feelings that were on backlog. I think that's a really important part of recovery or finding more balance with substance, is that you have to feel the things that you're escaping with the substance, whether that is with a licensed and trusted therapist, whether that's on your own, just allowing yourself to cry. I realized that I used to cry all the time in childhood, and in my adult life, I almost never cry. And I think it's important because part of why we're using is sort of the shame of those emotions, the shame of actually feeling them or having them or being sad. And especially when you have a growth mindset and you always want to be doing better and better, you're like, I don't have time to stop and cry. I don't have time to feel these things. So that was big. And then lastly, walking and exercising. I can't explain how much I feel that lifting weights has changed my brain chemistry forever, but also just walking. I read a study on how, as you're having any sort of forward motion activity, whether that's bike riding or walking or running, as your eyes are taking in your environment, your eyes are sort of naturally switching from the left to the right as you're looking at this tree or this car or this flower. And that movement of your eyes, that lateral movement from left to right, mimics something called EMDR, which is a technique in therapy that helps your brain to process emotions and have less of a fear response. So I think that was really big too. I was using a lot of substances when I was afraid. I was afraid of getting certain tasks done in the day. So I would drink a bunch of coffee to numb that and have adrenaline and like go towards it. Or I was really anxious at night or fearful of XYZ. And so I would just smoke to make it all go away. So I think adding in a lot more walking not only just helped to kind of get things moving and help my mental health, but I think it really helped with lessening my fear and helping me to process my emotions as I was walking.
It's really powerful. Like fitness, I think, no matter what the form is such a big catalyst for transformation, no matter what you're going through. And I think it's really cool that you were able to use it for that part, but then also for a way to process your emotions, right? Like something for me is I go on like a light jog, fairly regularly throughout the week. And it's not necessarily for my cardiovascular health. It's more so I can just process my thoughts and process my emotions. And I want to dive more into the topic of addiction because I think I heard you say in a podcast that you actually had thought about, or you could see yourself going in and being like an addiction specialist or an addiction therapist at some point in your life. Given what you've gone through in your own addiction journey, and then also what you've learned by interviewing people and just studying on your own, what do you think we could do a better job of? Like, what can people, like as a whole, do to understand like the subject of addiction?
I think number one, we can talk about it more. You and I started before this call a chat about how not many people are open about these kinds of things or want to admit that they're smoking weed every night, or it's not a very sexy thing to talk about, and it can come with a lot of shame. So I think just breaking that stigma, and then again, that information giving way to understanding and compassion. Anna's work of there's nothing wrong with your brain. You're not a morally bad person. This is just how we're evolutionarily wired. And we have to be addicted to something. You just have to make it kind of a good addiction. I think that's a really good way to think about it. And that's sort of how I've reframed it now, because I would consider myself addicted to exercise in a way, because it's something that I now need. It's the habit that I've replaced my maladaptive coping mechanisms with. And if I don't have it for 1 or 2 days, I kind of do go through a little bit of withdrawal, or my mood is kind of off. But I'd much rather be addicted to exercise than to any of the other substances of choice that I was leaning on before. So I think just normalizing it, taking the shame out of it, and building healthier habits that we can be, quote, addicted to, especially ones that are kind of painful. Like going back to that pleasure and pain balance, right? I love lifting and weight training because there's pain to it, right? But you get so much pleasure afterwards. So it kind of trains my brain to not be afraid of pain. And then obviously more mental health support as well. I think we're failing as a society a little bit there just due to access to services and really well trained and well informed therapists. I know growing up, I had gone to a lot of different therapists to try to get support for what was going on in my home life. And often the therapists that were in my network and covered by insurance were just not helpful, or in fact kind of made things worse. So I think that's tough. I think really good care in this country, mental health care, is really expensive. And it's a huge barrier and something that I'd love to change.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, we definitely need to continue to reduce the stigma and talk more about these things. And I think we've come a long way with mental health. Like I think like 30 years ago, people weren't really talking about it, and it's a lot better now. But like you said, I think access is important. Being able for people to be able to get help and services for a cost-effective way is something that needs to continue to get better. And hopefully it does as time goes on. And I think the role of therapy has kind of changed too, because back in the day it was like I need to go talk to somebody, right? That was like what therapy was. And now it's more transition into, all right, like I need to go to therapy, but what am I going to do to like take action, or how is this therapist going to help walk me through this process so that when I go, I actually can see some changes that I can carry with me for the rest of my life. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because I think it's so important for people when they're looking to make any transformation in their life, is this notion of identity. In that a lot of times, people want to make these changes and they start to make some changes, but they still have that old version of themselves that's weighing them back. That could be, like you said, it could be old friends, could be old habits, it could be past memories, it could be whatever, like fill in the blank. That's like bringing them back a little bit. And I think you really have to be fully committed to identifying and moving towards that newer version of yourself and just not looking back when you're looking to make a kind of a change. How has identity for you, how has that helped you make sure that these changes that you've made have lasted?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I did an identity exercise alongside the funeral that I held mentally when I both quit coffee and then decided to really get serious about diet, exercise, and lifting. So For example, in September, when I decided to stop eating hyperpalatable foods and really nail down my diet and, track how much protein I was eating and go on this fat loss muscle building journey to really get to the body that I knew I could achieve, I laid in bed the night before I started this big change. And I held a funeral for the excess weight and inflammation that I was holding. And I let the different parts of myself, or again, like the cartoon organs that you imagine in your head gathering for the funeral, kind of say their piece. And interestingly enough, this might sound so silly, but I know your audience is a lot of women, so I know my fashion girls will understand. But interestingly enough, part of me did not want to let go of the excess weight that I was holding because I wouldn't be able to fit into all of the clothes that I had now made a whole wardrobe out of. So I had to actually let go of that and say, it's fine, they served me, but I'm ready to step into a new body and have to get new clothes because of that. And then I held a little identity exercise where I pictured myself with my ideal body with, muscle and shoulders and biceps and abs. And I thought, what does this person act like? When this person is standing in my kitchen downstairs, how are they holding themselves? What are they doing? What comes naturally to them? And I pictured this person having like tidying up the kitchen coming really naturally to them because they're not lazy. They're like constantly proactive. They're constantly moving or looking for something to do. They're not looking for ways to expend the least amount of energy, which I think is always how I was. I was like, how can I do the least amount of things possible and move the least? And I just kind of pictured, how is this person in social interactions? How are they acting when they're out to eat with friends? What are they ordering on the menu? What's the mindset that they're going into that meal with? Are they figuring out, how can I nourish myself with protein and vegetables right now? And how can I have that beautiful nutrition on my plate? Or are they going into it with that scarcity mindset that I always dieted with in the past, which is, how can I eat something really delicious that's not too high in calories and like restrict myself? And I kind of just went through a day in my mind as that person with this rock hard bod and these habits. And I pictured my attitude, my thoughts, like I just completely embodied that person. And I imagined how good it felt to be standing in that ideal body with that much joy and energy and will to move and help. And I guess that also tied into being less selfish. Interestingly enough, this version of me is continuing to be less selfish. And the next day I woke up and I was like, that's it. I'm her. This is how I eat now. This is what I do. Like, went downstairs, tidied the kitchen, like literally just never looked back. And it's now January. So it's been about 5 months since I started. And my physical transformation has been exactly what I pictured. I mean, I don't have huge biceps yet, but they're coming.
You'll get there. And it just seems that you're so committed to doing what you can to improve your health from all aspects, right? And it's really, it's admirable that you were able to like take that day where you had the funeral, then you had this identity day, and then never look back. Because there's a lot of people that they would have a day where they identified who they wanted to be, and then the next day when they go back into the real world, like stuff happens, and then all of a sudden that goes on the back burner. Like, how did you keep this like front and center for you, like amongst the busyness of your life?
I think it's really just about holding that vision. I think that's why the visualizing aspect is so important, and why actually picturing how it not only looks to be that person, but how it feels to be that person is so important. Because as you're feeling through that, you can say, oh, I don't eat like that. Like, you can picture someone like, passing you a big plate of French fries and you're like, yeah, I love those fries, but I've tasted those before. I don't really eat those all the time. Or like, I guess I just kind of practiced that kind of language of I don't or I do as I was doing the visualization exercise. And then it was much easier to kind of repeat that in my real life. So I just kind of woke up the next day and I was like, yeah, even though I haven't done this for the last 6 years, maybe, as who I am today, I don't do that. I actually just don't. And it was just very clear, like, I do this or I don't do this statements that I just kind of allowed to play in my head from that place of an identity. And it will feel like you're faking it at first. It'll feel really out of character with like who you are at that moment because you haven't fully physically embodied that new identity just yet. But it's so important to kind of like cosplay as that identity and almost have that like alter ego that you're stepping into that almost can feel again like a joke at first or like you're faking it. But one day it just becomes reality.
It's so important because you hear a lot about people, they have idols, they have heroes, they have people that they admire. And obviously I think that can be very instrumental. But I think that's something that's also instrumental is kind of like what you said, when you create that identity or that alter ego, that version of yourself that you want to aspire to be, and that becomes your new hero, that becomes your idol, and that's what you have to like measure up against whenever you're looking to make a decision. And speaking of nutrition and wellness, I know like one of the other things that you've overcome is, we're trying like every wellness fad diet in the books. And then eventually you just kind of turned your back on it. You're like, all right, I'm done with this. I'm going to go back to a more sustainable way of eating. So when that journey all started, like, were you coming at it from a place of inadequacy, or did you like genuinely concerned about your health? And then how did that journey evolve? And like, what was the moment like where you kind of turned your back on the wellness fad industry?
Well, I think that I got into the wellness world so early. Again, I started my blog and Instagram in like 2012. So I was there for sort of like every ebb and flow of wellness trends. And I tried them all. I was raw vegan. I was fruitarian. I like only ate fruit for 28 days to see if that would, give me all of these, promised effects that these gurus teach about, which it absolutely did not. I was just freezing cold and hungry all the time. I kind of like just fell for every single trap in the industry. And I guess at that point, it did come from a place of inadequacy, of kind of giving away my power to someone else. And also believing that it couldn't really be that simple to just go back to basics and be consistent and like spend the time and habits working towards what you want. I almost wanted to believe that there was still like a quick fix, or there was something that like science hadn't discovered yet, or some holier, more spiritual answer to diet and lifestyle that didn't require me to just buckle down and do what I needed to do. And maybe that is born out of me growing up in the 90s and having all of those as seen on TV ads that overpromised all of these things and were almost like evangelical. But I just kind of believed all of them. I outsourced my power. And at the end of the day, I think I just realized the truth is really simple. Like the things that actually work in life, in, nutrition, in fitness are the most simple, basic things. And they're not really attractive. They're not things that are going to get a lot of clicks on the internet. And usually when you do see a fantastical title or blog article or promise, it's, the opposite of truth. So I guess I just realized, and perhaps through my dopamine journey too, that the things that work and like get you results and are good for you in the long term are usually actually really boring. But when you do them every day, the results that you get aren't boring. They're amazing results. So I just kind of came to terms with the fact that I was going to need to simply become aware of the macronutrients and calories and protein that I was eating and work really hard to meet those numbers each day and see it as a numbers game and a data game versus seeing it so emotionally or spiritually or trying to get some amazing effect from a diet. And I just buckled down and was like, let's just go back to the basics of thermodynamics and science. And it worked.
Imagine that, right? Again, like, thanks for opening up and sharing all that, because these aren't easy things to talk about. Because like you said, like a lot of times when people jump into these wellness trends, it's from a place of inadequacy, or they're feeling low about themselves and they're looking for just some quick fix to make them feel better or to improve themselves so that they can stop feeling in so much pain. But like you said, the solution to all of this is just mastering the basics, making sure you're eating enough protein, getting enough fiber, enough fruits and vegetables. I mean, walking, strength training, sleep, water, like all the stuff that isn't sexy, right?
That you can't sell. Yeah.
Right. And I'm just really blown away by all the levels of your transformation, how open and vulnerable you are when you share all of this. And I think, a lot of people are going to relate to what you had to share on this episode. And I think this is like a perfect place for us to end our combo. So I wanted to first thank you for coming on and sharing what you did. And then if people want to connect with you, if they want to learn more about you, they want to listen to the podcast, where can people go to do that?
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram at organic_Olivia. And then my website, where I have all of my herbal formulas, because I am an herbalist. So I have, herbal blends for digestion, anxiety, sleep, all that good stuff to support you on your journey. That's organicolivia.com. And then my podcast is called What's the Juice?
What's the Juice? I love it. I will make sure to put the links to that stuff in the show notes. And for those listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Olivia said about her childhood or dealing with trauma. Maybe it was something that she said about how she turned that negative and scary situation with her parents during the pandemic into something positive. Maybe it was something that she said about addiction and how she's healed from that, or how she has dealt with, being selfish and how she's, used that to grow into a better version of herself. Or even if it was something that she just shared about the wellness trends and how she has learned to just master the basics instead of falling for the next fad. Whatever the takeaway was, tag Olivia, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst. We'll see you next time.